In this episode, we're tracing a connection between a queen, a long weekend, and her lasting influence in Canada. It's a story that turns up in more places than you might expect. Walk into almost any old cemetery in Canada, and you'll start to notice a pattern. At first, the grave markers are small and unadorned, very practical. Then something changes. Headstones become larger, more detailed, more present. And woven through all of it, almost invisibly, is a single influence. A woman who never set foot here. A woman who never saw these communities or met its people, and yet somehow shaped how they mourned, how they remembered, and even how they built spaces for their dead. And here's the strange part. Every May, we celebrate her. A long weekend, fireworks. It's the unofficial start to summer, and most of us don't even think twice about the history. But that same figure behind that holiday is written into the landscape of our cemeteries. But who is she? We know her as Queen Victoria. Victoria became queen in 1837 at just 18 years old. At that moment, the land we now call Canada wasn't a country. It was a collection of British colonies: Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. Each with its own identities, tensions, and growing pains. You may recall in the last episode the Upper and Lower Canada rebellions, which were actually taking place when she ascended to the throne. Victoria's reign would last 63 years, the second longest in British history. And during that time, Canada changed completely, from scattered colonies to a united dominion in 1867. Under Victoria's reign, this land began to look and feel like a modern country. Now, let's be clear, Confederation didn't mean independence. Canada was the Dominion of Canada, still firmly within the British Empire, with Victoria as its queen. And it's important to pause here to acknowledge that the idea of nationhood depends on where you stand. Because while the new country was taking shape, relationships between the Crown and First Nations were being defined in ways that were complex and often deeply harmful. Those relationships, those agreements and tensions were shaped through colonial policy and treaty making, and their effects are still with us today. And although Queen Victoria didn't actually have a hand in the day-to-day decisions that were made about Canada, but her influence was unmistakable. In a time of geopolitical uncertainty, the Crown represented stability, continuity, a sense of belonging to something larger, an empire. At the time when the United States had broken away from Britain, Canada made a different choice and stayed. It's a decision that shaped Canadian identity in ways that we still feel today, a link to the Crown, our parliamentary system, and a slower, negotiated path towards independence. And Victoria became the symbol of that path, even from a distance. Because for all of her influence, Victoria never actually came here. Not once. Oh, she was invited, including for Confederation, but she declined, partly because of the long Atlantic journey, and later because of her deep withdrawal from public life after Albert's death. And that absence didn't weaken our connection. If anything, it made it symbolic rather than practical. In 1860, Canada prepared for a royal visit, and instead of the Queen, we received her son, the Prince of Wales. He was just 18 years old when he traveled across British North America, stopping in cities that were still defining themselves. In Montreal, he oversaw the opening of the Victoria Bridge, which was named after his mother. And when he arrived in Ottawa, he laid the cornerstone for what would become Canadian Parliament. It was a country building itself under her name, even in her absence. And that brings us back to the one decision that stands out. In 1857, Victoria selected Ottawa as capital of the province of Canada. At that time, Ottawa was a rough lumber town, not exactly an obvious choice. But it sat between English and French populations and far enough from the American border to feel secure. That one decision still shapes this country's political map today. And it's the kind of influence that might not always feel immediate, but it settles in quietly in our institutions, in our geography, and eventually in the way the country remembers its dead. And one of the clearest places to see that influence is in a cemetery. If you spend any time in older Canadian cemeteries, especially ones from the mid to late 1800s, you start to notice something. Victoria is everywhere. Not in name, but in the way that grief is expressed. Her reign coincided with the shift in how people understood death. This was the era of elaborate mourning customs, of landscaped garden cemeteries, and of a growing focus on memorialization and its permanence. And to understand why, you have to look at something deeply personal. In 1861, Prince Albert died, and Victoria was devastated. She wrote that her life as a happy person was over. She described Albert as her anchor, her guide, her entire world. And his death didn't just leave her grieving. It left her unmoored. And she didn't hide it. Victoria withdrew from public life for years. She wore black for the rest of her life, nearly 40 years. Rooms were preserved exactly as Albert had left them. His clothes were laid out daily. His presence was, in a sense, kept alive. This wasn't a private grief. It was public. It was ritualized. And it was constant. And because she was queen, that grief became something that others followed. Across Britain and in Canada, mourning became structured, almost formal. Widows were expected to wear black for years. Jewelry included the hair of the deceased. And postmortem photography preserved the dead. Cemeteries became places not just for burial, but for visitation. Death moved out of the shadows. Now, the grief remained personal, but it became visible and acknowledged. Now, Victoria didn't invent this culture, but she intensified it, and she made space for it. And you can still see that influence carved into 19th century Canadian cemeteries. Look at the markers from this period. There's more symbolism, more elaborate monuments, and language that lingers on loss and memory, and ultimately reunion. Grief becomes something permanent, not just felt, but etched into stone. And there's something quieter too. Victoria mourned for so long and so publicly that grief became part of who she was. She wasn't just a queen who lost her husband. She was the grieving widow personified. And that identity echoed outward into the homes and communities and into the way people understood loss itself. But here's the one final detail that makes that story feel a little more complicated. Because when Victoria died in 1901, she didn't choose black for her funeral clothing. She chose white, a silk gown and the lace wedding veil she had worn more than 60 years earlier when she married her beloved Albert. She was buried beside him in the mausoleum she had built after his death at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle. After 40 years of mourning, she set her grief aside, not in her own life, but in her own death. And maybe that shift from black to white is part of the story too. Not just grief, but the possibility of reunion with her beloved Albert. And in Canada, a country that was still forming and still defining itself, those ideas took root and they stayed. It wasn't just about one person, it was about an era. And Victoria represented it. So why do we celebrate Victoria Day? Victoria was born on May 24th, 1819, and during her lifetime, it became a celebration across the British Empire. After her death in 1901, the celebration was discontinued in the UK, but Canada made the deliberate choice to keep celebrating it. The holiday became what we now call Victoria Day, and it is observed on the Monday before May 25th. The holiday initially honored Queen Victoria, but over time its meaning has shifted, For many Canadians today, it's less about the Queen and more about fireworks and opening the cottage, maybe a long-awaited break after winter. The history fades a little bit, but the name stays, and with it, the quiet link back to its 19th century roots. Victoria never saw the land we know as Canada. She didn't witness full independence, and she didn't live to see the 20th century unfold. But she helped shape the framework that all of this grew from. And every May, when Canadians step into the long weekend, whether it's for fireworks or a trip to the cottage or just a quiet day off, they're taking part in a celebration that stretches back nearly 2 centuries. It's a reminder that history doesn't just live in textbooks. It lives in our cemeteries, our place names, and our institutions. And sometimes it lives on in a holiday we look forward to every year without always knowing the history behind it. But I hope that now maybe you do. I'm Stephanie, and this is Dead Canadians Carved in Stone, where we reveal Canadian history one cemetery at a time.